I'd been gone just under 2 years, long enough for strangers to forget who truly owned the land their homes now stood on. When I left for Geneva, it was to finalize my tenure at the United Nations Urban Planning Division. A year later, I was returning as the newly appointed Minister of Urban Development for my home country. I expected congratulations, fanfare, maybe even a few emails from overzealous developers trying to get close. What I didn't expect was 312 luxury condominiums sprawling across the ridge where my great-grandfather once planted olive trees. It took 3 wrong turns and a growing sense of unease before I realized I hadn't misread the maps. My family's land surveyed, registered, and sacred had been transformed into a glistening concrete jungle, complete with rooftop pools and valet parking. My breath caught in my chest as I parked at the gate. There was no construction signage, no permits posted, just a private community entrance labeled Golden Rise, a sunset haven, by Crestfall Development. "Can I help you, sir?" A security guard, perhaps no older than 25, approached with a clipboard and the weary tone of someone used to entitled visitors. "Yes. You can tell me why there are over 300 buildings on my ancestral property." He blinked. "Your what?" I pulled the deed from my briefcase, stamped, notarized, and older than the city's own land registry system. I'd kept it with me all these years, more out of sentiment than necessity. Now, it burned with new weight in my palm. "I suggest you call whoever's in charge here," I said, "before I call the Department of Justice." 10 minutes later, a sleek electric SUV pulled up. A woman stepped out, all posture and polish. Her name tag read Elaine Crestfall, HOA president. "Mr.," she prompted. "Minister Adrian Navarre," I replied coolly. "And unless you can produce a federal rezoning order I'm not aware of, you're standing on illegally seized property." Her smile faltered, just a flicker. Then came the lines I expected. "There must be some misunderstanding. All documents were approved. The land was vacant for years. The community had no record of ownership." I didn't flinch. I didn't dot blink, because I had every record, and she had none that could stand up in court. But I wasn't here just to reclaim my land. I was here to make sure no one like her ever did this again. Elaine Crestfall invited me into her office like a hostess greeting an inconvenient relative, pleasant, poised, and absolutely panicked beneath the surface. The HOA headquarters, tucked inside one of the new towers, smelled like fresh paint and desperation. She gestured toward a leather chair. "I assure you, Minister Navarre, everything was built according to protocol. Our paperwork has been reviewed and filed with the city. And let me stop you there," I said, laying the deed across her polished glass desk. "Your development Golden Rise sits on 19.6 acres of ancestral land that has never been sold, subdivided, or rezoned." She glanced at the document, then at her assistant, who was already sweating. "Minister, perhaps we could look over the plans together. There's clearly been a miscommunication." "Miscommunication doesn't explain forged authorization documents." Her eyes narrowed just for a second. She didn't deny it. Instead, she slid a thick manila folder across the desk. Inside were contracts, rezoning requests, environmental assessments, and, finally, a single-page approval document bearing a shaky signature, my name. Except it wasn't mine. I studied the loops, the tail on the N, the awkward spacing between my middle and last name. It was an imitation, and not a very good one, clearly copied from my older academic letters, back when my signature was less deliberate and far less protected. "You submitted this. When?" "About 14 months ago," she said, too quickly. "All notices were sent to your last known address." I was in Geneva, working for the UN. My office address is public. So are my diplomatic credentials. There's no excuse for not verifying this with me directly. Her voice softened, shifting into damage control mode. "Minister Navarre, over 300 families live here now. Seniors. Young couples. Children. These are good people who bought their homes in good faith, and your company sold them dreams built on theft." Her mask cracked. I saw it in her jaw tightening, calculating. "You have to understand," she said, voice low. "We were told the land was dormant, that the family had abandoned it. The developer, my husband, he believed everything was legitimate. We had signatures, permits." I leaned forward. You had forgeries, you had arrogance, and now you have a scandal." Her face paled. I knew what she saw now, not just a landowner returning home, but a government official with full jurisdiction over zoning and land disputes. She tried to recover. "Surely there's a way we can resolve this, privately." I stood. "There will be a resolution, but it won't be quiet, and it won't be kind." As I left the office, I looked down from the glass corridor onto the courtyard below. Children played. A man watered a rooftop garden. A woman hung clothes from her balcony. None of them knew the truth. Not yet. But they would. Because if I let this slide, it would happen again to someone without the power to fight back. And I had more than power now. I had the law. I had a reason. And I had nothing left to lose. If they thought this was going to be a quiet land dispute, an uncomfortable but forgettable civil case, they'd clearly never dealt with a man who spent 10 years rewriting international zoning ethics for post-conflict regions. The moment I left Elaine Crestfall's office, I wasn't just reclaiming land, I was laying a trap. I spent the next 48 hours rebuilding my case like a demolition engineer sketching blast zones. Only instead of bricks and steel, I was dealing in legislation, municipal code, and geopolitical leverage. My first stop was the Ministry Archives, a place I knew better than my own kitchen. I pulled satellite maps, soil usage reports, water rights, historical title chains documents that would take a civilian lawyer months to gather. But I had the keys. I had the access. I had authority. Then I dug deeper. Why had this project been greenlit without triggering the Department of Heritage's red flag? Why were no environmental impact assessments made public? Why was there no media coverage of a 300-unit mega condo breaking ground on virgin land that hadn't been touched in generations? Because someone had buried the entire paper trail. But they didn't know how far down I was willing to dig. At 2 a.m. on the second night, I found it. A permit application, signed by a ghost name, someone who didn't appear in any prior land registry filings, whose ID number was tied to a defunct insurance account from 2009. It was like stumbling across a false floor in a secure building. And the signature, a modified scan of my own, run through a distortion filter to mask inconsistencies. Sloppy, childish even, and still, it had worked. I leaned back in my chair, my temples pounding with exhaustion and fury. They had defrauded the system. They had manipulated zoning boards, bribed registry clerks, exploited legal gray areas, and pulled every shortcut imaginable. But they had made one mistake. They assumed the name on the original deed was just that, a name, a piece of paper, an obstacle. They didn't know it was me. By morning, I had filed a total freeze on all Crestfall development activity, pending federal investigation. I bypassed local zoning boards and went straight to the National Planning Oversight Committee. I drafted the injunction myself, appended with a 20-page dossier and over 50 exhibits of evidence. The seal from my office meant it hit the chief zoning auditor's desk before noon. By lunch, every Crestfall construction site in the region had been shut down. Elaine called me 3 times that day. I didn't answer. Her fourth call came from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice, once sleek and commanding, now cracked with urgency. "Minister Navarre, please, let's meet. There's more you need to know. We weren't the only ones involved. You're playing with powerful people." Of course I was. They always think that phrase will intimidate you. Powerful people. As if the mere idea of influence should be enough to send a man like me running. What they didn't understand was that power without legitimacy is just a house of cards. And I had just started blowing. The hearing was set for the following week. In the meantime, I made another stop, the Registry of Land Use and Urban Infrastructure. That's where I found it. A scanned receipt, 2 signatures, one from a recently retired city councilman, the other from Richard Crestfall, Elaine's husband. That document transferred zoning authority of 6 adjacent parcels, most of them belonging to my family trust, into Crestfall Development's Strategic Growth Initiative. It was dated 6 months before the zoning board even reviewed the case, a full quarter before public discussion, a full 6 months before any vote. The fix had been in from the beginning. But this story wasn't just about legal traps and forged documents. There was something bigger brewing beneath it all. And I felt it most when I returned to the site. I wasn't in a suit that time. I wore jeans, sunglasses, just another man walking the edge of a place that was no longer his but shouldn't have ever stopped being. I watched children run through a splash pad built over my great-grandfather's irrigation system, listened to jazz echoing from a rooftop cafe whose foundation had been poured over, a stone wall my grandmother helped build by hand. And for a moment, I hesitated, not because I didn't want to fight, but because innocent people were now living in the middle of my war. Was it their fault the homes they bought were born from fraud? No. Would their heartbreak soften the weight of what had been done? Also, no. And so, I made a decision. I wouldn't tear down the condos, not unless I had to, but I would tear down the ones responsible. I was still reviewing documents at my office when my secretary stepped in. "There's a journalist in the lobby," she said. "She says she's here about Golden Rise." I raised an eyebrow. "Send her in." A woman in her 30s entered, her movements swift and confident, a tablet in one hand and a press badge around her neck. "Minister Navarre," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Callista Rowe from Urban Affairs Weekly. I heard what you did to Crestfall's permits this morning. That was fast," I said. "In this city," she replied. "Real estate news spreads faster than scandal." She tapped her tablet. "Is it true you plan to pursue criminal charges for forgery? I'm not ruling anything out. And what about the families who've bought those homes? Will they be displaced?" "That depends," I said carefully, "on whether they're willing to become part of the solution or defend the people who lied to them." She studied me for a moment. "You're not just trying to win this legally, are you?" "No." "You're trying to destroy them." I met her eyes. "No. I'm trying to expose them. If that destroys them, it's because they built their empire out of rot." She smiled slightly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "I'd like to follow this story. Off the record, if needed. You're making enemies, Minister, dangerous ones. I've faced worse," I said. "And this time, I'm not just a victim." I pointed to the master zoning chart behind my desk. "I'm the guy who wrote the rules." By the end of the week, the word forgery was on every journalist's lips. But the phrase that made the Crestfalls truly sweat was something far simpler: federal probe. The headlines went from speculative to scathing. "Minister targets Crestfall empire in illegal zoning scandal, Golden Rise, built on a lie." The minister's land war just went national. The first should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the slow churn of collateral damage beginning to stir beneath my feet. It started with the first email. "Minister Navarre, I'm a single mother living in Unit 1206. I had no idea the land was stolen. Please don't evict us." Then came the voicemails. A retired veteran asking if his service would be considered when deciding whether he could stay. A young couple begging me to spare the building where their child had taken their first steps. One woman cried on the line for 2 straight minutes before even saying her name. The Crestfalls had built more than a fraudulent empire. They had built a shield, a wall of innocent lives that would bear the brunt of my justice. And I knew it, and I hated it. That night, I didn't sleep. I drove back to the development. This time, I walked the interior of Golden Rise, past towering glass elevators, quiet hallways, and dimly lit lobbies with overpriced art. Everyone was already asleep, their children safe in bed, their mortgages stacked with interest. The place had a heartbeat, and I could hear it. This wasn't just real estate anymore. It was a living, breathing community built on stolen bones. I stood outside the building I knew had been constructed directly over my grandmother's old orchard. The street sign read Crestfall Lane, and my gut twisted, not because of rage, but because of what it would cost to undo the lie. By the time Monday came, the first countersuit landed on my desk, filed by Crestfall Development. It accused me of abusing my ministerial power to weaponize zoning law for personal vendetta. It was absurd, laughable even, but it was strategic, because now the media could say there were 2 sides. And even when the facts favored me, the narrative didn't care. Every camera crew that showed up to question the Crestfalls was now parked in front of my ministry building, asking if I intended to make 300 families homeless. Elaine Crestfall even staged a press conference, standing in front of Building 7, with her hands folded solemnly. "We welcome legal transparency," she said to the cameras. But Minister Navarre's approach seems more focused on vengeance than fairness. Our buyers deserve protection, not punishment. It was a polished performance. And, unfortunately, it worked. Public support, which had been overwhelmingly on my side, began to fray. Comment sections turned toxic. Op-eds argued that I was setting a dangerous precedent by letting personal heritage cloud public duty. Even some of my colleagues in government began to distance themselves. "Let the courts sort it out," one of them said. "You're too close to this." Of course I was. That land was mine. But now the question was whether I'd be seen as a protector or a tyrant. The turning point came 3 days later when Callista, the journalist from Urban Affairs Weekly, sent me a secure file. "You need to see this," her message read. It was a video, grainy, time-stamped, captured by a night vision trail cam, probably from one of the adjacent wildlife zones. In the video, Richard Crestfall, a flashlight, a box of documents, and a clerk from the land registry office, someone I recognized immediately. They met at 2:47 a.m. Richard handed over the box. The clerk signed a blank form. They shook hands. And just like that, I had them. It wasn't just a forgery anymore. It was a criminal conspiracy. I forwarded the video to the Office of the Inspector General, then called in a favor from an old friend at the Ministry of Justice. 2 hours later, warrants were signed. By nightfall, the clerk had been arrested for fraud and document tampering. His confession unraveled the rest. Turns out, he'd been paid $150 to falsify the entire zoning chain, retroactively backdating permit approvals, deleting zoning objections, even fabricating public consultation reports. He didn't know who else was involved. But I did, because none of this happened without Elaine Crestfall's signature. The next morning, I held my own press conference. No more silence. No more backroom chess games. I understand the outrage. I told the cameras, no one wants to lose their home. No one should. But this isn't about punishing families. This is about justice and about restoring the rule of law where it was bent for profit. I laid out the facts, the forgeries, the bribes, the evidence trail. Then I offered something unexpected. We will not evict any residents. My office will be launching a buyout initiative for the property beneath Golden Rise. If residents choose to stay, we will honor their investment at reduced land cost, minus what the Crestfalls illegally gained. No one will be punished for someone else's crime, but those responsible for the fraud will face the full weight of the law. Gasps, murmurs. One of the reporters began to clap before catching herself. The message was clear. I wasn't backing down, but I also wasn't burning lives to the ground. I was here to rebuild, not destroy. That night, I received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a photograph of me at age 9, standing beside my grandfather on that very land, both of us smiling in front of the old olive press. On the back, in neat handwriting, he'd be proud. Keep going. There was no signature, but I didn't need one, because I knew this wasn't just my land anymore. It was my purpose. It began, not with sirens or arrests, but with a whisper, the kind that spreads faster than facts. By the time the morning news caught up, the streets around Golden Rise were already thick with cameras, murmurs, and people who sensed something big was about to fall. That something was the Crestfalls. But this wasn't going to end with handcuffs. Not yet. Because first, I wanted the truth to walk into the light on its own. The official audit was released at 8:00 a.m. Sharp 257 pages of damning evidence gathered by the Office of the Inspector General, the Zoning Oversight Commission, and a third-party urban law task force I'd personally authorized. It detailed every manipulated permit, every falsified environmental study, every bribe, and, most importantly, every fake public comment record used to justify the illegal construction of 312 high-end condos on land they did not own. Within an hour, Crestfall Development stock had plummeted 81%. Investors fled like rats from a burning ship. Their largest creditor froze all further funding. 2 board members resigned. The tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing down. And Richard and Elaine Crestfall were standing directly in its path. But poetic justice isn't complete without accountability. in plain view. So I requested a formal hearing, public, televised. They had no choice but to comply. The courtroom overflowed press activists, residents from Golden government officials, and students who had once studied my zoning frameworks now sat ready to see whether the rules held in the real world. Elaine entered in navy, conservative, no jewelry. Richard in charcoal gray, trying not to sweat through the cuffs of his $1,000 suit. I sat opposite them. For the first time, we were in the same room but no longer on equal footing. The prosecutor read aloud the charges: forgery, conspiracy to commit zoning fraud, obstruction of regulatory processes, illegal profiteering on government-protected land. Their lawyer tried to mount a defense. The minister's personal involvement compromises the integrity of this process. This is not about land. It's about revenge. I remained silent until the judge turned to me and asked if I had any closing remarks before the committee voted on further criminal referrals. I stood, and the weight of 4 generations stood with me. This land was not just property, it was legacy. It was my grandfather's olive groves, my mother's first sketches as an architect, the place where I learned how to read boundary maps before I knew how to ride a bicycle. It is sacred in a way that paper can't always express, but that every person in this room can feel if they've ever loved a piece of earth as if it were part of their blood. I let that sit. What the Crestfalls did was not a clerical error. It was not a misunderstanding. It was theft on a grand, calculated scale. They didn't just steal land. They stole trust in our zoning system, in our institutions, in each other. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. Because if this fraud had succeeded, what chance would the next family have? Or the one after that, the next immigrant landowner, the next war widow inheriting her father's home? I paused, locking eyes with Elaine, whose face had gone expressionless. This case isn't just a trial. It's a line in the sand. And I'm here to say, you do not cross it. The vote was unanimous. All findings were upheld. All criminal referrals advanced. And the final nail: the city repossessed the Crestfalls' remaining unsold units and placed them in a public trust. The profits from future sales would be redistributed to fund housing assistance programs and zoning reform grants. Their empire wasn't just dismantled, it was converted into justice. But my story didn't end with their collapse. It ended where it began, on the land. Weeks later, I stood in front of the crowd gathered on the lawn outside Building A. The olive grove had been restored, replanted from cuttings preserved by a local agricultural university. Children played under their shade once again. Golden Rise was no longer a private island of privilege. It was now called Navarre Commons, managed by a newly formed resident cooperative. Titles had been legally corrected, fraudulent deeds invalidated. Families who wanted to stay did. Those who didn't were fairly compensated. And the land, it was finally at peace. Callista found me watching the sunset, arms folded, boots sunk into soft earth. "You did it," she said softly. "No," I replied. "We did." She held up her phone. "They're calling it the most historic zoning reversal in state history. Catchy. You going to take the credit?" I smiled. "No, I'm going to take the weekend off." We laughed, and in that moment, I felt it, the slow, honest return of something I thought I'd lost in all the red tape and courtroom tension: hope. Later that night, I walked the edge of the grove alone. The air was warm, quiet. I stopped at a small stone marker placed by local residents, unsolicited, unexpected, to the one who remembered what land is worth beyond money, beyond politics, beyond power. I closed my eyes and let the silence sink in, because this wasn't just a victory. It was a vow, a reminder that no matter how high they build, justice grows deeper, rooted, unshakable, and ready to rise.